Okay, so in our last video, one of the things we looked at was these measures that we get from a flow volume loop. And this idea that we can, from a flow volume loop, a maximum inspiration and then a maximal expiration, we can measure FVC, which is forced vital capacity, FEV1, which is the amount of air you expire in that first second of that forced vital capacity, your maximum flow rate, FEF max, and then your mid flow rate, FEF 2575, or forced expiratory flow rate between 25th and 75th percentile. And these are important because it allows us to distinguish between some potential lung disorders. And we generally divide these into two categories, obstructive and restrictive. Now, these may sound similar, but they're quite different, and the lung disorders that you'll deal with can often be different as well. So let's start with obstructive. Anything that's obstructive, that's going to be characterized by a limitation in air flow. And so often the analogy I use for this is imagine you're driving on a road like the turnpike or an interstate. It has 3 lanes, and then there's an obstruction, an accident in one of the lanes, right? So you'll still get through there, right? But your flow, the speed at which that will go through will be slower, right? Now, you'll still get through, right? Same amount of air is still going to get through. It's just going to take a little bit longer. That would be an obstruction. A restriction, and I'll try to use the same analogy here, a restriction would be if we just reduce that road from 3 lanes to 2 lanes for the entire length of the road. Now we haven't just changed speed, we've actually changed how much flow, how much traffic can actually get through there. If you view it that way, then understanding lung volumes and understanding the flow volume loop is really helpful because there's obstructive disorders. These generally include COPD, emphysema, cystic fibrosis, and then there are restrictive disorders. Pulmonary fibrosis, interstitial fibrosis, scoliosis, even obesity. Technically, severe obesity can be considered a restrictive disorder because it's not allowing the lung to fully inhale because there's pressure against the muscles allowing it to do that. And so we kind of view it that way. Restriction is something that's restricting volumes. Obstruction is something that's obstructing flow. Obstructing flow, restricting volumes. And so if you grasp that, then understanding how these are different on a flow volume loop should make sense. With obstruction, we're going to get air through, but the amount of time it's going to take us to get there is going to be a little bit less. Restrictive, we'll get air through, the volume though will be less. And so here's a good way to think about this. When we have something that's obstructive, the two things that are almost always decreased will be the flow rate, particularly the mid-flow rate, and the FEV1 divided by FVC. Because the amount of air you can get out in a second is much, much less. Because again, there's this obstruction. Now, you'll still get all the air out. It'll just take longer. So typically in an obstructive disorder, this FEV1, FVC is always decreased. Your flow rates are usually decreased as well. With restriction, actually that's rarely the case. Now, the flow rates sometimes will go down, but in a restriction, it's not the amount of air you can get out in a second that's reduced, it's the total amount of air that's reduced. In a severe restriction, you actually could have someone who, let's say their lung volume gets dropped to 1.5 liters, which is a severe restriction. In theory, they could get that whole air out in 1 second, so their FEV1, FVC would be 100%. Which sounds great. It's like, oh, that's awesome. You're getting all that air out. It's not good because they have so little air to get out. They could do it all in a second. That would be a very, very severe restrictive disorder. So when we delineate between obstructive and restrictive, this is what we're talking about. Obstructions is something that's going to reduce FEV1, FVC, something that's going to reduce flow rates. And then we have restrictive disorders, which is going to reduce volumes. Now, there are situations where you can have both, and there are things like asthma, forms of asthma, which can cause both of these to potentially occur, though more typically you will have more of one of these than another, even in multi-disorder lung functions, lung issues. So obstructive, restrictive. The next couple slides just go through what's normal, what's not normal with these. Pretty much the rule of thumb is once you get below 75% of your age predicted, in other words, what you should be for your age, your height, your weight, your gender. If you're 80, 70% below normal of that, that's usually what we start considering abnormal. So if you're 95% of normal, that's normal. That's key because when we do this in lab, not everyone's going to be perfect. Some people will be above normal, some people will be a little below normal, but all that really is in the whole category of normal. Same thing with FEF, FEV1. Again, usually it's not until we get to the 70% below normal that this really becomes an issue. All right, our next video, we're going to start looking at some other things related to lung function, things like asthma, things like not just exercise-induced asthma, but why is this important when it relates to oxygen in the blood?